What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to Celio's Network. Today is episode 2 of Celio's card ranting, or whatever it is that I named the series. I forget now. Something like that, but I brought a special guest along with me today, James Arnold. James, why don't you introduce yourself?
Hi everybody, my name's James, also known as Wames, and I have played the Pokemon trading card game for as long as I can remember if you ignore the first 8 years of my life. And I have a lot of opinions and a lot of thoughts, and Pokemon trading card game in particular, but the franchise itself is such a huge part of my life that it's something that I'm always thinking about. So I'm always interested to hear everybody's thoughts and to learn something new about design every day.
Awesome. James, I'm just going to shut off my camera on your end so you won't be able to see me anymore. So
Okay.
for those of you watching on the video, if there was a couple skipped frames, we should have that fixed now. But yeah, so James, like he said, he's been playing for a very long time, and he and I will always, like, in passing on social media or message each other, Twitter, whatever it is, talk about Pokemon cards, but especially the design. And we usually both have pretty similar thoughts on card design, I think, and just like distaste for the way the game is right now, especially in standard format, I'd say. And so since you all seem to like my first episode of Celio's card rant about Celio rants about card design, that's it. That I should write down my names of my series. So yeah, since y'all seem to not completely hate that series or episode 1 of it, I decided to bring James on, and he'll probably be back in the future for this too, because we both have a lot to talk about on this topic. And so I asked James to pick some cards that he would like to talk about, and the first one he has is Shiftery Ex. And I already know I love this one because we started talking about it just a tiny bit before we started recording. So James, why don't you tell me what's special about Shiftery Ex and why you wanted to talk about its design?
Sure. So something that's special about Shiftery Ex. Shiftery Ex was a card from Crystal Guardians, which was a set released at the end of 2006, making it legal for the 2006-2007 standard format. It did see some success while it was in standard, but it also sees a lot of success now when we're revisiting the EX block itself, which I find very interesting in and of itself, that it's kind of finding more success in the afterlife than it did in the when it was in its heyday. But the interesting thing about the design on this card in particular is it kind of like describes perfectly to me what the difference between Poke Powers and Poke Bodies versus abilities are as far as game design goes. The In 2011, when Black and White came out, they split away from the Poke Power and Poke Body mechanic into condensing it all to be abilities, therefore like simplifying the cards and making it to where I mean, you end up with less text on cards, right? Because when some cards would interact with Pokebodies, some cards would interact with Poke Powers. That can be confusing in and of itself, especially to a newer player. Whereas if you just make it to where everything is an ability, then it's just all much simpler, which has its advantages for sure. But Shiftery EX in particular, Pokebodies were more reactive in nature to something that was happening within the game. And that's something that I think Shiftery EX did spectacularly, is when your opponent would use a Pokepower, basically activate an ability, such as something like Jirachi's Stellar Wish in the current day.
Yeah, a once per time thing, or like you choose when it happens, almost kind of thing.
Yeah, like an ability that's like a once per turn or whatever, like a Malamar from Forbidden
Light, and trade and make do, those kinds of things.
Yeah, so it would place 2 damage counters on a Pokemon using a Pokepower, therefore like doing something on your opponent's turn. and it's something just it was an interesting layer of card design because it wasn't like you making a decision during your opponent's turn and like breaking the flow of the game, because it was something that was in play. Your opponent knew what was happening. If they chose to make that decision, it was going to place 2 damage counters on your opponent's Pokemon when they activated that Poke Power. And that's something that I've really missed as I've like seen the cards come and go over the last 10 years, is that when we did move to abilities, it while the simplification is very good as far as the rules go and teaching someone the game, there's a lot of design space that kind of got lost, because while there have been some reactive abilities over the years, it mostly is just like a proactive thing that you're doing on your turn. You do X, get X. And it's just, there's a lot more design space and more interactivity that goes on when you had that split, as far as like a Pokemon taking less damage. And we have seen abilities like that, like Samurott from Black and White had the take less damage. That's just the first thing that came to my mind. It's not even a super relevant card.
I don't know how Samurott.
Yeah, I mean, my brain works in mysterious ways.
I can tell that one just tells everybody that didn't know how James' brain works. That just told you. The first one that I would have thought it was Double V, because it's in standard.
That's a much better example. It's a relevant example and a playable card. But to me, Samurott is a card that I played at Worlds, so like it's something that like
that makes sense.
But it's the same concept of card. As it takes less damage, but there's like more design space and things that you could do. Something that you brought up right before we started was Alakazam for Mysterious Treasures, and that card gave you an active decision during your opponent's turn to discard 2 cards to cancel out one of their Poke Powers, and that's something that I think the game could use a lot more of, is that interactivity and interplay between the cards. Because I firmly believe that the more decisions that are made per game, the more skill intensive a game is. Just like regardless of Pokemon in any game, in any kind of context, the more decisions that are being made, the more thinking that goes into things, and the more chances for someone to mess up comes up. And I just think that that's a really interesting thing that is missing from the game. And Shiftery in particular was cool because it stacked. It was one of the Pokemon that, like, if you got 4 in play, when your opponent used an ability, they would take 80. And that's just something that's really cool, because as your board grows, if they don't overtake that board without using their abilities, then they're going to just continuously get more and more punished as the game goes on. And I think that that's a really cool interplay that's kind of missing from card design these days.
Yeah, absolutely. This era, so Shiftery Ex was 2006. I started playing in actual like sanctioned tournaments in 2007, but like 2006, 2007, 8, 9, 10 were all really, really fun. And they're like, it just reminds me of a time where like I would like finish school, or my mom would come home from work, or I would get done doing something, and like we would want to go play cards as soon as possible and like practice and get better and stuff like that. And Pokemon never felt like a chore back then, because like I felt like we were always improving and games were always playing out in different ways. And a recent time like that to me is 2017 NAIC format, when like Zoroark non-GX Zoroark Drampa, and then like Espeon Garb Drampa. Definitely less like you said, we now have abilities instead of powers and body, but I felt like around there was skill and there was decisions to make, and we were evolving Pokemon, which is now a foreign concept. But at that time, me and my friends were like so pumped on getting better and figuring out like different techs and different plays and mapping out matchups that we would just play into the night. And now it feels like the game has gotten to a point where like sometimes we barely want to play a set. So yeah, but definitely, like you said, more decisions to make and the interaction. Now, something you did mention that people might not be aware of is that there's kind of a line when Black and White started being made, and I debunked this rumor in my recent video about card design, but people always said that they switched to design teams in 2011 when they switched to black and white, but they actually never switched design teams. They just kind of switched their ideology of design. When I
they
believe
kind of just like streamlined it a little more.
Exactly. I think they started making the cards for, instead of like 10 and up, saying 6 and up or something, or something like that. And yeah, there became the era of big basics for the first time. The abilities instead of powers and bodies. We don't see 2 weaknesses on a card anymore like we used to on the Shiftery Ex that we're looking at. Double abilities were gone for a while and came back briefly in Steam Siege. So yeah, it became much more streamlined for younger players. So that was kind of like an initiative or an ideology change in the design team. But a lot was lost for the competitive aspect and even the fun aspect. Like there are younger people that play other card games with a little bit more, decisions and a little bit more to learn, and I think it's even more fun when there's more to learn. But I kind of understand that. We won't go too much into like the reasoning why or whatever. It's to sell more product, to get more kids into the game. But I think Pokemon cards will always sell, even if it's incredibly complicated to play. They'll just buy the cards to put them in a binder. So I kind of wish that never happened, like you were talking about.
Because I think that like you were saying back in 2017, and I've thought a lot about how the game has changed just within the last few years, and it comes down to, regardless of the format, regardless of the context, whether it's all big basics, whether it's evolutions, it's about the number of decisions per game. To me, that feeds that desire to want to replay a game. Like a game's replayability is almost rooted in the number of decisions that are made, because whether you win or lose, like if you are making multiple decisions per game, like you're able to figure out that maybe if I hadn't made these 2 decisions like this, then the game could have ended up differently. Let's play again and find out. And something that has kind of like, and the other thing that I always try and stress is, it's not that Pokemon now is skillless. I mean, look at the players that consistently do well.
Yeah.
Most of them are still the same. It's not that the game is void of skill now. It's just that a lot of the game's replayability, I feel, is gone, because the matchups and the game is so rooted in the macro decisions that are taking place of do X, do X, do X this, do X, do X this. And whereas before it's like, I need to do this, this may happen. And there was a lot more of that interplay that made the game's replayability so much higher. There's only so many times that I can sit there and play against ADP right now. Like I can't sit there for 12 hours a day and play the ADP matchup. I will literally pull my beard out of my face. Like there's just not, it doesn't matter what I'm playing. It doesn't matter anything. They're going to do the same thing against every deck every single time. Like, and then so much of the game is, did they whiff it or not, rather than did they decide to do X or not? And that, I think, is the biggest change between now versus 2017 versus 2010 versus 2006 and so on and so forth. And it's not that we can't get back there. It's not that I think the power creep of the cards is too high. It's literally just the context of the format itself that creates that. I think that you could have Pokemon with 600 HP and still balance a format.
Yes.
And that's something that I also have tried to discuss with people, where they're like, the numbers are just too big now. I enjoy playing base set only online almost daily. I'm all about jab for 20, and that's perfectly fine. But to me, the numbers themselves matter so much less, as if the entire format is balanced around the numbers, you can balance it around any number you want.
Yeah, it's about the context. Like if you have 600 HP, and everybody else is only doing 200 damage, then okay, we're getting 3-shot, we can heal, that's interactive. But if you have 600 HP and every attack is doing 600 for 2, then that's an issue.
Exactly.
So right now we kind of have, we're definitely, sorry Shiftery, we're way off your topic now.
I mean,
but
it all ties in though, right? Like, and
but,
that's what I kind of feel like it just leads down that path of where cards like Shiftery made for that interactivity and made that replayability, and that's just a design philosophy that I think we can get back to, and that we will, and that I even have hope for in the Sword and Shield On format potentially.
So
but
I will say for Shiftery EX, so we actually have a Pokemon very similar to Shiftery EX in the current format, printed as an ability. It's just that it could have been put on so many other Pokemon and actually had a chance, but they had to put it on a new Pokemon that evolves from a rare fossil, and the rare fossil doesn't have acceleration like Research Lab did for unidentified fossils. Like, they could have given it to any other stage 1 and we would have been in there, like maybe having slight rogue playability. But if you don't already know what I'm alluding to, I'm speaking of Arctozolt from, is it Darkness Ablaze or Rebel Clash?
I believe it's Darkness Ablaze.
Okay, so Arctozolt from Darkness Ablaze. Blame James if we get that wrong.
It is my fault.
But yeah, so it reads very similar to Shiftery. When your opponent attaches an energy from their hand to one of their Pokemon, put 2 damage counters on that Pokemon. Whereas Shiftery is when one of your opponent's Pokemon uses a power, put 2 damage counters on it. And it also stacks like Shiftery did. So like, there's instances like that, and if you watch all my videos or a lot of my videos, you'll see me say like, wow, the card designers are doing something really cool here. I hope they keep pushing that envelope. So Creatures still does have some of that oomph and some desire to have interesting cards, I think.
And I think what bringing up Arctozolt is a really interesting point comparatively to Shiftery, because if you look at Shiftery, we're looking at a card that dealt 2 damage counters for its reactive effect in 2006, when Stage 2 prize Pokemon had 2 weaknesses and 140 HP, versus a Pokemon that evolves from a fossil dealing 2 damage counters in 2020 to a once per turn thing that literally, like, Pokemon have 340 or more HP at times now. Like, that's just, to me, that's a perfect example of, if we're gonna, like, certain things like reactive abilities or anything like that just haven't scaled. And that's something that I think Shiftery got right as well, because when you're looking at a 60 HP Jirachi in 2006, like, taking 2 damage counters is a very relevant amount to use its ability.
Yeah, or like the Pidgeots, I think they had 80 or so, the relevant Pidgeots, 80 to 100. Yeah.
But you would have like Curse Stone, which was put a stadium that said put a damage counter on each Pokemon with Pokepowers, and that comboed really well with Shiftery. And it's just something that, like, if we're gonna like promote reactive abilities, we've got to get them onto Pokemon that are more relevant or easier to get out, or at least have more of a payoff. Like, if Arctozolt dealt 4 even, like, that card would be very powerful, but not, I think, too powerful, being restricted by its fossil evolution and just the fact that you're attaching an energy once per turn usually in most decks.
Yeah, so what, it would like maybe counter Welder decks, and then even at that, it would be like kind of in a hole there. Even it would just counter that and be like hopefully good enough against regular decks.
But like, you get 3 of them out and you just beat Blacephalon, because if they welder to it and attach for turn, it dies. Like, at least you've got something at that point that like the damage adds up to something. But the problem with Arctozolt is that the damage doesn't add up anywhere. Your opponent takes 60 damage as they attach 3 energies to their 320 HP Pokemon, and they laugh at you as they KO.
Yeah.
Like,
yeah, so yeah, I definitely love Shiftery, and the scaling is a big thing. So yeah, like, I like that we brought it back to that. Like, the design team in Japan, they still are making cards with a lot of reminiscent abilities and attacks and effects, and I try to point that out whenever I see it. Like, the new Dusk Noir and Vivid Voltage has Crystal Beach as an ability, but it's just not strong enough. There was another one in Vivid Voltage that has like an attack as an ability, or vice versa. I can't remember off the top of my head.
What I find even interesting is the new Shiftery coming out that changes your opponent's supporter. I think it's funny that it's a Shiftery even.
Hmm.
But the thing is, and I think that that card could end up still seeing play, but again, we're locked to a stage 2 with such low HP comparatively to what the other, like the basics in the format now have. And it's just, if we're gonna like have these reactive abilities, the Pokemon have to be in play long enough for them to react.
Yeah.
And if it all has to scale appropriately, and that's something that I think that Shiftery got right, and or Shiftery Ex got right, and that a lot of the reactive cards that we do get when we do get them just don't.
Yeah, it's funny because looking at that Shiftery, I think when I did my first impressions on it, I think I said like this card would have actually been like a very good card back in the day, like at its current printing, maybe bump its damage down by a little bit because its attack does bring something up and do 120, and then you can switch their Pokemon. So maybe if that was
Yeah.
like 70 and then you could switch their Pokemon, everything else on the card could keep the same. It would have been good back in like '07 because it
Yep.
has 140 HP, I think, which is the same as this Shifter EX.
Yep.
So just make it an EX, and then its ability, like I love it because it's not saying your opponent can't play supporters, your opponent can't draw cards. It's saying
Yep.
they can, but they're only going to see a couple cards off of it, and they have to make a plan to get rid of your Shifter with these cards.
Yep.
So I love that, but just not strong enough to today's cards.
Yep, and especially with the change to rare candy that occurred. I mean,
Yeah.
and I that could be a whole separate video at this point. But
Yeah.
just the playability of stage 2s is just so hampered before you even get to what they do that
Mhm.
like it's just so.
Yeah, like the new Charizard can do 330 for 2 energy, and we're like, probably not gonna work.
Yeah,
That's
exactly.
crazy. That's crazy. Okay, so let's move on to the next one. Wames has brought a bunch of cards. The next one is a pair, Rockets Admin and N. So a lot of you watching this probably know what N does. Each player shuffles their hand, then you draw the cards equal to your remaining prize cards. But its predecessor was Rockets Admin. So I'll just read it off real quickly. It's a supporter. Each player shuffles their hand into their deck. Then each player counts their prize cards and draws up to that many cards. You draw your cards first.
Mm-hmm.
So, James, why did you bring Rockets Admin to the video today?
Well, I had an opportunity to spend some amount of time talking about my favorite card in every any game, and so here we are. I legitimately believe that there are two cards, and they're both from the same set in 2004, and they are some of the best designed cards that the game has ever seen.
They absolutely are.
And I know that this is a divisive opinion. I hope that you all don't unsubscribe from Celio at this moment because he has this person talking about how good of a card N is, but it legitimately epitomizes what the game should strive to be, in my opinion, because In and Rocket's admin across all of the formats that they've been a part of, every single one that In was a part of for years and still is viable in expanded today. It doesn't see as much play as it used to with like copies of 4 in addition to 4 Versus Seeker, but it's still an extremely important staple card. And I think that speaks volumes to its power level. And but not in a way that's like it's too powerful, but just the effect that it has creates such an interactive game state that impacts every decision that you make every single turn of the game just from that card existing.
Yep.
And that is why, like, I think that another card that we're going to get to later may be a better designed card because I legitimately believe it to be the best designed card of all time. But In and Rocket's Admin is my favorite card. Literally what it does is I look at cards basically two ways. Does this card make the game more interactive between the two players? And does this card basically influence deck building in any sort of interesting way? Does it influence the game outside of the game?
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not saying that every single card needs to do both of these things in order to be a good card. Like, I don't need like my random basics that evolve into Zoroark to influence the game and deck building outside of the game. But like, what I think is really interesting as far as like interesting card design and design space goes is if you can make a deck based around a card, then that is promoting like a different form of thinking and a different form of interaction before you even get to the game itself. So if a card can do that, in addition to influence decisions that are made by both players in the game, I think that you've got a really, really, really well-designed card on your hands. And in Rocket's admin, because of the way that they punish your opponent for just blindly being aggressive throughout the entirety of the game, in that if they don't have a board set up to handle having their hands stripped away from them as the game progresses, then they literally get punished and will end up possibly reaching a fail state as you're able to come back from behind. And that's something that I think the game is desperately missing now. And I it's a meme and it's a joke, but the years that I've like traveled and competed typically are the years where in is legal in standard. And I find myself playing the game less and competing less assuredly when in is not legal in standard, because I find the games to just be that much less dynamic comparatively, that it's just so much less fun that I would rather just play a version of the game with in or Rocket's admin in it versus not. And because of that, it literally, like, if you're playing a game and in is legal in the format, every single discard that you do from the beginning of the game attributes to your overall win rate during that game. So as you're playing your turn 1 Ultra Ball, as you're playing your Mysterious Treasure, as you're playing Quick Ball to discard a card, all of these things come into play. Like each card that you would discard to Giant Hearth, all of these like taxes as the game goes on, you're using to thin your own deck to give yourself the highest probability to both create the best board possible prior to having your hand stripped away or prior to making a move to take prizes. And that's something that the game just does not have now. Like Boss's Orders and Lysander and Gust Effects are something that I have been vehemently against being able to utilize when you're ahead in prizes for a long time now. But to not just fully derail myself, the reason I'm bringing that up is that I didn't have a problem with Lysander or even Guzma being a card in the game when it had a check in the form of in, because it's so much less interactive to just like take a KO, boss up your guy, boss up your guy. When you have an opponent that is able to in you, you're not guaranteed to just be able to boss up your guy, boss up your guy. If I go in after your first KO, in after your next KO, and so on. And it forces you to possibly not take KOs until you have more of a board set up, increasing the size or increasing the length of a game, therefore increasing the number of decisions that you're making per game, therefore making the game a more skillful game. So in and Rocket's admin, to me, literally perfectly encapsulate being able to force both players to make both micro decisions and macro decisions about the game itself and how to take their KOs, that it changes everything. And it's so different, because I've fought tooth and nail with people on Twitter about this, where they're like, but James, reset stamp is legal and it replaces in. And that's really cute that people think that, but the problem with that is that reset stamp sucks. Reset stamp sees play in decks, of course, especially decks that are able to like control decks that are able to capitalize off limiting your opponent's hand. The problem with reset stamp is that in and of itself, it decreases from the consistency of your deck. In and Rocket's admin specifically both can create an environment where you're playing a card that continues to increase the length of the game and increase the interactivity while also increasing the consistency of your deck. If you have an in on the first turn of the game, you're able to play it as a shuffle draw 6, essentially. And that may even come at a cost to you if your opponent went down to 4 cards on their first turn. You're giving them extra cards.
And that's another decision to make.
Exactly. And so it's just, it piles on decision after decision after decision, and it's something that I really feel the game. If you just put into standard right now, I think that the whole ADP boss metagame doesn't change the fact that that deck is playable, or probably doesn't even change the fact that that deck is the best deck or the deck to beat at least. But it makes it to where there's going to have to be decisions made. Because if I KO your ADP and then KO the one Zacian you have, and I in you down to 1 or 2, good luck if you don't have another Zacian already charged. Like, I'm going to take another KO potentially, and you're going to lose the game because you decided to go in too early. And it's just the combination of so many layers of decisions, I feel really makes the card shine. And I'm sorry to just like completely go into the rant, but
Oh no, that's fine.
Like, reset stamp specifically bothers me on a card design level because it feels like it was meant to replace in, but if you're playing a card to help you when you're behind, playing a card that decreases your consistency isn't exactly helping your cause.
Yeah, it's a negative.
Opinion.
It's a -1. So you'll notice that reset stamp. It's been played very frequently since it came out, but it's the place where it actually consistently pivots games is where it's always a -1, but where it's one step forward in your game plan, and that's in control decks, where the like reset stamp Mars Chip, which is also like the worst kind of lock the game has ever probably had, but but the reset stamp Mars Chip, you're reset stamping to go one step into your combo, where you can kind of take that negative because you've spent the whole game drawing your entire deck to just wait until you can stamp chip whatever. Where, like you said, most decks that play reset stamp, it's either a dead card early, you use it because you're about to dump your hand and you use it to shuffle a 5-card hand, or shuffle a 6-card down to a 5-card or something like that. Or you hit it later, and let's say you like the Dene for 6 and you hit a stamp. Okay, great, I can stamp my opponent down to 2 or 1, but that reset stamp didn't do me anything, so now I'm just going to sit here, do nothing, and hope my opponent whiffs. And that's sometimes what happens. The other thing I wanted to say, actually 2 other things, because you sparked a lot of thoughts. When we were talking, when you were talking about and even being seen in play over the past decade, even now it's still played and expanded, but in less numbers, I directly contribute that to you don't need to play 4N4 Versus Seeker if a game is lasting 5 or 6 turns. But back then, a game would last 8, 10, maybe even more turns, so 4N4 Versus Seeker sometimes wasn't even enough. But now we can just play like 1 or 2 N and 3 or 4 Versus Seeker, maybe a dowsing machine, and you have more than enough N to go around in today's environment, regardless of what format you're playing, expanded or standard. If N wasn't standard, you would only need like 1 and a couple Versus Seekers today. I will also say, because I think this is a comment we'll get, is that we do have Marnie. Now, Marnie I don't see as a replacement to N, but I did love the unique design of Marnie, because it's not just a copy and paste card. So I was very excited to see that when Sword and Shield got revealed, that it is a card that draws you less cards, so you're digging through the deck less. It potentially helps you see the cards you want, and sometimes it's better than playing a Cynthia, depending on how many cards you have in your hand, because you get to put them at the bottom, then draw, and you can also disrupt your opponent. However, I do think Marnie has become very bittersweet, because so often your opponent will have a large hand of cards that they didn't need, and you'll help them effectively thin their deck by putting those at the bottom and help them get into the card you need. I was wondering how you felt about Marnie.
So Marnie specifically to me has I always like encourage seeing something new. Like, even if it turns out to not be a net good thing, or there comes out to be issues with it, I'm always interested to see new design space explored and something different than just like reprinting Cynthia at that point or whatever.
Right.
Marnie itself, to me, specifically has a couple design flaws that bother me pretty significantly. The put it on the bottom of your deck, I think, is a bust. Like it not only effectively thins the deck for your opponent, therefore negating the hand disruption effect in a lot of scenarios, but it also like because of the first turn rules of the game being what they are, putting your opponent down to 4 before they get to play a supporter is never going to feel good nor balanced. Like in would always give you 6
at the
like
beginning of the game.
yeah, unless there was some kind of combo that you were doing with like Electrode EX or Electrode GX or knocking out your own guy in order to force them to take prizes and then put them down, which at that point in has now hit that other category of influencing your deck building decisions and therefore is a cool card because of that. But like Marnie is just like one of those cards that like no one's deck is being influenced by Marnie, like the deck build. Nobody and it creates these it never does what it was intended to do, in my opinion. And obviously, I'm not a prophet. I don't know exactly when they designed Marnie what they had in mind for it to do, but it feels to me that they were trying to fill that hole that In had, where it was a consistency card at the beginning of the game, but could also disrupt your opponent late. So it's like this combination of Cynthia and Judge. But the problem with that is that the shuffling to put on the bottom does not effectively randomize your opponent's deck to try and properly disrupt their hand. It directly influences how it disrupts their hand in a way that your opponent basically gets to decide how that influences them.
Yeah, and so there are a couple things I will say that I would disagree on. I agree with most of it, but I do think Marnie has influenced deck building slightly. Marnie gives a +1 reason to play Aranguru Primate Wisdom Index, because you can set a card to the top, so if your opponent Marnies you, you can actually draw into what you needed. And honestly, that's one of my favorite interactions in the game right now, just because standard format is so dry on interactions.
Sure.
It feels really nice to actually have controlled something. Like, oh wow, I am going to win a game because of something I did and not because I drew 4 cards that I needed off of a research. So that's something I do like. And another thing is players did not top players held Green's decks in very low regard after Marnie came out. And now that's not necessarily deck building influence, it kind of just killed off an archetype of decks. But Green's decks have come back, but notably or historically in the past few sets, Green's decks do not like to come up against decks that have heavy Marnie because they want to build a hand.
Yeah, and something that I found interesting about that interaction specifically was Greens. Oh man, that should probably be a card that we discuss on a future episode in and of itself, because I wish I would have thought about that, because that's one of the cards in recent years that I really love the design of. But regardless, Green specifically, I feel, just got hit on both sides from the Sword and Shield release, between the changing of the first turn rules so that you can't greens when you go first, in addition to Marnie being released to where your hand gets limited. That, like, Greens obviously, like you said, has made a comeback, has seen results now, isn't completely dead, but the card was so interesting and so decision influenced, and just being hit on 2 different axes or axi or however from the Sword and Shield release, literally, like, that it really bothered me to where, like, I'm glad that there's something that was countering Green's deck or some counterplay to it, but like In would have done just the same thing, but on a better scale.
Yeah, it would have countered Green's decks, you know, after they actually got to start playing the game. But yeah, Green's decks, not to go on too long about a card we're not even talking about today, but I mean, that's kind of what we've been doing the whole time. These cards on the screen are just a suggestion. But yeah, Green's, from what I remember from last year's Worlds up until Sword and Shield, Green's decks were mostly being played and being successful in the hands of very good players. Like, I remember, I think it was Blaine Hill that got top 4 at Worlds with Green Zard, or top 8 at Worlds with Green Zard. And then now Tord Reklev was championing Green Centiskorch for a tiny bit. And that just goes to show you, because these decks right now, they're super fragile. So more than ever, you cannot make even the second best play with them. Like, you have to make like with greens, you kind of get to make 2 plays at once. You get to choose 2 cards. Like, you have to choose best card and second best card. Like, even if you choose best card and third best card, like, you're gonna lose probably. Like, you have to be so precise and have a good game sense on what you think your opponent's going to do next turn, because if you don't get Marnied, you get to prepare for next turn with this turn's greens. And you also have to know, what can I do if I can get to do one thing to my opponent right now? Do I need to plant? Do I need to stamp? Do I need to remove an energy? Do I need to buff my HP? Excuse me, but it gives you a lot of options that other kinds of decks don't allow you to have, because other decks, it's dump and draw 7 and see what I get, and I'll play those cards. So yeah, greens, I'm upset as well that it was kind of stifled with Sword and Shield, especially with the first turn rule. Even if we didn't get the first turn rule change and we still got Marnie, I think greens would have been better off even with Marnie around, as long as you got to play it on turn 1.
I agree entirely. The first turn rule change to me is one of the most egregious rules changes the game has ever seen. Because I mean, I've seen them all, and the first turn rules have changed several different times, and I vehemently despise what the current first turn rules are, given the context of what the game is.
Yeah, that would be a good one maybe to talk about on a future episode.
Sure.
Okay, so we talked about Rocket's admin and N, and then the last one James has brought to talk about today is Welder. So Welder came out in the Unbroken Bonds set. It's a supporter that draws attached to fire energy from your hand to a Pokemon and then draw 3. So this card was highly played and highly successful as soon as it came out in Reshizar decks, because coincidentally it came out side by side at 270 beast that did 300 damage. So James, what were your thoughts when you told me that Welder was one of the cards you wanted to talk about?
So this is something that I've talked about a lot as well, and I think that it is a minority opinion. Could be wrong. It'll be interesting to read the comments.
Yeah.
But I personally think that Welder is an extremely well-designed card, and that I legitimately believe it to check lots of my boxes in design space. But it brings up an interesting point of, you can design a card really well and have really good intentions with a card, and then not have it pan out in exactly a positive manner. So Welder, to me, both influences it. The thing that it checks the box the biggest on, more than any other card that we've discussed or probably will discuss, it influences the way your deck is built. You can't just play Welder with like 6 fire energy in your deck. It literally constricts the way that your deck is going to work, to the point where a lot of the time with Welder, and it used to be greens and Welder at different times, or Pokegears with Welders and then Boss's Orders, but in a lot of Welder decks, Welder is now especially the only supporter that you're going to find in that deck, because it's the only thing that the deck wants to be doing. And that in and of itself comes a lot of deck building decisions and a lot of building around Welder that needs to take place. I do think that releasing it with Reshizard was an issue, especially given the context of the format at the time. Reshizard isn't exactly dominating now, but it's still a powerful card that is played in multiple decks. And I legitimately believe, and I'm not getting into the double colorless energy thing here today, but
today
I thought about it. But I legitimately believe that their intention with Welder was not to have it replace DCE for decks that have colorless energy cost.
No, I don't think that either.
It's not that they didn't want it to happen, but I don't think that they intended for it to become that for a lot of decks. And I think that if you literally just took Welder and said that it could only weld onto fire Pokemon, the
Mhm.
card is so much better designed at that point without like actively changing the majority of the decks that it has seen play in.
Yeah,
Uh,
I think they
Mew
did that with
3 would be a big
Frostmoth.
one.
They with
Yeah.
Frostmoth, I think they might have realized that, or even if they didn't realize it, then they like it was just a side thought that like, yeah, we shouldn't let this just attach water energy to anything. It should have to be water. It feels
Yep.
like that. It feels like that could have even been a decision they were thinking about with Welder. So shortly after they made Frostmoth have that water only on the bench stipulation.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I think Welder only to fire Pokemon would have been really, really good. It also would have nerfed Rushy at release because Rushy was playing 1 to 2 Evilax in their deck.
Mm-hmm.
So it would have made that less dominant over evolution decks as well right at the start. But I don't know, because in my heart I know that competitive Pokemon players buy like 5% of cards and everything else is investors and collectors, but I think they wanted to push, like, they're always pushing an archetype that like they really love these days, and like they wanted to push the Welder plus Reshi
Yeah.
thing, and I don't think they wanted to do anything that could have prohibited that from happening.
I agree. I think that it's interesting because like we've definitely seen a change in Charizard's cards over especially the last 2 years, given the entire context of the game compared to the last 2-3 years as far as like the power level of each iteration of Charizard that they print every single set. And I just think that with Welder specifically, it's deck building restrictions to where you're usually finding not every Welder deck, but the majority of Welder decks are running upwards 12, 14, 16 fire energy in addition to fire crystal. Like,
Mhm.
so you're already taking up so much of the deck, making that deck somewhat inconsistent regardless of how you build it otherwise, because you have this chunk of fire energy in there just to make your engine work. That I do feel like at the end of the day, the card is still really well designed. And I know that people, not as much now, but you saw a lot
Mhm.
of hate for the card when it first came out,
Yeah,
as far as like,
absolutely.
this card is broken, it ruined the game, it's just the DCE replacement. And like, that doesn't make any sense to me because DCU did this and
And then play
that you're
Juniper.
done. Yeah. Or you play Juniper to find your DC,
Yeah.
or you played your DC and then bossed something up. You're
Mhm.
not doing that with Welder. Welder not only makes your deck a different experience, but in the deck building process, but also in the game, because you're not able to take advantage of all the other consistency tools and board manipulation effects that almost every other deck does have access to. So you've got to find a way. It interacts the way that you play the game and the way you build your deck. And I think that because it checks both of those boxes for me, it really is a well-designed card. Even though if I personally were designing the card, I would have made it only attached to fire Pokemon, because it's not like Reshizard gets any worse at that point. It's just you have to find different solutions to problems. And like the Evilax solved the Zoroark problem. Maybe Reshizard wouldn't have made it to the top at that point,
Mhm.
but yeah, I still think that it would have been a powerful card that did see play, and maybe people would have found a different answer at that point.
Yeah. So
I
like
don't know.
my thoughts, I think we would have still played Evilax, but Evilax would only come out in the games where you were able to bench it and then Flare Starter that turn.
Mm-hmm.
You wouldn't be able to just pop it out of anywhere with, Welder or whatever. But yeah, I don't have I'm not sure that I ever had a direct issue with Welder. I think my issue came that it was I was upset about tag teams, and the Welder came with the tag team that started the downtrend, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Because that's something I talk about on the channel probably daily at this point, but the downtrend for me was Unbroken Bonds. Like, Team Up was still, no matter what anybody says, I still think Team Up was a good format, and Team Up was a good set, although it did bring the first tag teams, because Pikarom didn't chase all evolutions out of the format. But Unbroken Bonds was like the beginning of the end for me, because Reshizard had so much HP, did so much damage, could one-shot anything, could go through any effect.
Outrage.
It had outrage.
So you couldn't even two-shot it, or it killed you.
Yeah. Kiawe was still in the format too, so you could just go bench Kiawe, go. So yeah, I had a lot of problems with Reshizard, so which in turn I think might have made me have issues with Welder, but Welder in itself is not a card that should ever be called broken, because it gets around the energy attachment rule, but only for fire. And like you said, I think it would have solved any issue that people could have with it if it only went to fire.
Yep, and I think that's something that they explored, and I mean, it's just another, I just thought of this as far as design space goes, but something that they did throughout the Sun and Moon block was push different types in different ways, and that's something you even see now. Like, you saw the Prism Star stadiums for almost every type, maybe every type, I don't remember, but literally, I don't think water got one. But I think that that was interesting design space. It's interesting when they push different types in different ways rather than different specific cards in different ways. The special energies that they're releasing now, I think, is very interesting. It's exploring a different design space. Each card is doing something that it maybe has seen in the past in the same color as maybe not seen. Or at least hasn't seen in a while. And like, hiding energy, I think, is really cool. I think the fire energy that boosts your HP is really cool. Don't know the name, but heat energy.
Yeah, fire.
Yeah, I'm great. So I think that that's very interesting as far as pushing the specific colors go. And I mean, that it's something that I think is a problem, is when you push specific, like, you'll push fire with Welder, right? And you'll push metal with Metal Saucer. And how are we pushing the other types right now? We're not really. So, like, you're sitting there and you're like, okay, I mean, I guess I'm sorry that there are fighting Pokemon being printed, because there's not really anything going for them right now. And I know that they had their heyday with Strong Energy and Deancey Prism at a time.
Yeah,
but
we're getting
right
a new
now,
Fist Energy, new Stone.
I'm ready.
Colossal's the only thing I want to play when Vivid Voltage comes out.
Yeah, I'm ready to Fist Energy.
Yeah,
immediately.
I'll have to send you my list after the video.
I'm excited. If
you are a patron of mine, ad time. Link is down in the description below. I wrote and I published a 2,500 word article on Colossal VMAX about a week or two ago. The list is really good, and there's also a tech list that guarantees beats modern or current lists of Luke Metal. But if this list were to come out and do well, then Luke Metal could just change a couple things and beat it. But yeah, if you're not already a patron, consider subscribing for $3 a month. Link in the description. Back to card design. But yeah, I love when cards have flavor, and I think they've had more flavor in the past, and like you said, with the special energies, definitely coming back with the flavor, kind of like Magic the Gathering colors, but Magic has gone off the rails because they'll just give everything to Simic, but that's another conversation for another time. And
every card gained 5 life and drew 3 cards. Wouldn't that be fun?
But yeah, so we're going to go on to the cards I decided to bring for the video today. And the first one is Gardevoir EX Delta Species from Dragon Frontiers. Now, the big thing, this card only has 2 real attributes to talk about. It's 1 Poke Power and it's 1 attack. Its 1 attack isn't anything crazy, but it actually pairs really well with other Gardevoirs in the EX All format that you can play on TCG1, because excuse me, you have another Gardevoir that allows you to move an energy every turn, so you can just move your Holo on cast form from Gardevoir to something else and then move that energy. It's a whole thing. But Gardevoir EX, in Dragon Frontiers, they made 2 cards that each had their own counter, which correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's the only time they've ever made counters for a single card.
So the only thing that I'll say about that aspect is before burn, they had the char counter that Quilava in Neo Genesis had.
Okay.
And I don't think that any other card in Neo Genesis had it, but it basically gave your opponent a counter that, and then it explained the burn text because burn wasn't a thing.
Got it.
And so, but other than that, these were specifically designed for these cards. No other card has these counters.
Right.
And that, I think, in and of itself is just another layer of design space. There's also a Porygon that I don't think we ever got that changed the color of your opponent's, or the type of your opponent's Pokemon.
Ooh.
And you gave it a water counter, and that's how you'd like declared it.
Oh, wow.
And so there is other cards in this similar design space, but these cards in particular saw at least some level of standard play, and Gardevoir in particular has seen a new resurgence when having access to the entirety of the EX block.
In the EX
revisiting that format. Yeah.
Yep. So yeah, Gardevoir EX has Imprison. It's a Pokepower, and this could still, like, this could work as an ability. There's nothing stopping them from bringing back custom counters like this, or unique counters. But so once a turn, if Gardevoir EX is active, you can put an Imprison marker on one of your opponent's Pokemon, and a Pokemon with Imprison markers can't use powers or bodies. So you could promote Gardevoir, put an Imprison counter on your opponent's Pidgeot so they can't search for any card, retreat Gardevoir and attack with whatever you want. That Pokemon gets knocked out, cool, you put Gardevoir up, you imprison something else, retreat to your attacker, or use Gardevoir EX as your attacker. But there's so many cool layers to this because it accumulates every turn. You don't lock everything all at once. Right? You just lock one thing, you pick the most important power, you lock it, and then you go on with your turn. Next turn, if Gardevoir EX is still around, which it should be because things aren't doing 3,000 damage, you get to Imprison marker something else and block another power or body. And this card, ever since I was whatever age I was when I was in 2006, I've always thought this Pokepower was just phenomenal. And this is like, when I complain about standard format, these are the kind of things I'm thinking about, like, why can't we have these? And it's disappointing that they didn't even give other Pokemon this power back then. My theory on that is the set that followed Dragon Frontiers EX is Power Keepers. And Power Keepers was actually not designed by creatures. It was designed by Nintendo in the North American region. Because that was the one time we caught up to Japan with sets, and Japan didn't have a set for that quarter. And so North America made, I believe, over 50% of the cards from Power Keepers EX. And I think that's kind of why there might be some design change between Dragon Frontiers and Power Keepers EX, but they did a really well job with meshing it in. But that could be a reason why some things like this started in Dragon Frontiers and then it ended, and then Delta Species were gone after that anyway. So, but what do you think about Imprison, James?
So as far as Imprison itself goes, and kind of my thoughts on it, basically, I thought it was really cool because it's, again, design space that is basically unexplored based on what it does. It specifically is a card that forces you to make choices. It forces you to choose which power, ability, Pokebody that you want to turn off at this time. And outside of evolving, there wasn't a way to get rid of it other than, and this is something that they really did well back in the day, they would print something and then they would print a counter to it so that there was always counterplay involved, because there's a Tropius from back in the day that says when it comes into play, you heal all special conditions and remove all Imprison and Shockwave markers from your board. And that's something that I think is really cool from back in the day, where like they would create something new and then to make sure that it doesn't get completely out of hand, create a counter to it so that like you don't want to play Tropius in your
No,
deck, but if Gardevoir is a thing that you want to beat, maybe you have to take the hit on the consistency and the bench spot and being able to play it in order to just use your abilities again. And therefore influencing deck decisions, influencing in-game decisions. You'll sit there and you'll like, when you're playing against Gardevoir, do you evolve your Pokemon that has the Pokepower or Pokebody right now, or do you hold it? Because if you play it, it's going to get the Shockwave or the Imprison marker, and then that's not going away. But if you wait, then you'll at least get to use that ability. But if you wait, they'll Rocket's Admin it back into your deck, and then you won't have it to play. So it's just, again, creating the pie that used to be the Pokemon trading card game and finding the different layers to that pie and figuring out how delicious you want your pie to be. And I think that Gardevoir and Tyranitar both explore that design space where they originally they were two different theme decks, which is why they have the markers like that they were meant to like battle against each other basically. And that was their theme, and that's why they both have that kind of design space explored. And I just think that it's something that the game could use a lot more of, because again, influencing deck building, influencing in-game decisions, and to go off on a little mini tangent, but related to this Gardevoir, when there's a lot of complaints or a lot of reminiscing about the old days, so many of the Pokemon had abilities, whereas today you see a lot of these abilities that are, when this Pokemon is put onto your bench, do this. Back in the day, it was each turn, like, do you have the option to do this thing? And there were so many more Pokemon that had Pokepowers or Pokebodies compared to today, where you, like, a lot of the attackers just like are their listed attacks and they don't have any other kind of special ability or anything. Back in the day, you would most stage twos, I would even say, by the end of the EX block and heading into the Diamond and Pearl block, most of the stage twos, I believe, have a power, body, an attack, and another attack. So you're sitting there and there's so much text on the card, therefore creating different things that can happen throughout the game. Whereas today it's like stage 2, attack, stage 1, or ability, attack, and then a GX attack when those existed. But now it's just back to ability and attack. Like, and it's just like basic ability, 1 attack. There's less decisions. There's less like, it's you're hitting X thing because that's the only thing that this card is capable of doing.
Like, Eternatus VMAX is just, it puts me to sleep. Its ability isn't something you get to use. Its ability is a Pokebody. So its ability is essentially what would be a Pokebody, and then has 1 attack that does a linear damage at your opponent's face. It's like playing a video game with 1 button to press, and it's jump, and that's all. And I mean, okay, Super Mario, great game, but you also could walk in different directions. That's the
Pokemon Mario crossover you never expected Nintendo to release. Like,
but yeah,
it's just like, I don't know, there's more decisions. Like when a Pokemon has a small attack and a big attack, or even 2 attacks that have the same energy cost, that makes you decide.
So like, good.
It, like that's such like design space and decision that like the game is just missing. And to tie that back in with Gardevoir, the reason I bring that up is there's so many different Gardevoirs from the entirety of the EX block that you'll see a lot of times a 2-1-1 and then the EX split of all of these different stage 2s, because you want access to all of their powers at different times or in different matchups. And again, it just like, it's that layering of so many different things going on that like your decisions on both sides of the scale are impacted, and that's what I think is the core component missing from a lot of the cards designed today.
So next we'll go into Tyranitar Ex, which is the other marker from Dragon Frontiers that we were talking about. And Tyranitar Ex is a great example because while it doesn't have an ability, it does have 3 attacks. So Tyranitar Ex has the first attack, Electro Mark. Put a Shockwave marker on one of your opponent's Pokemon. That's all it does. And then Hyper Claws for 3 energy, it does 70. And if the defending is a stage 2, it does 90 instead. And then Shockwave, choose one of your opponent's Pokemon that has any Shockwave markers on it. That Pokemon is knocked out. So when today you'll see things like the amazing rare Eviltal that gave me indigestion that just says knock out your opponent's Pokemon. Back then you would have a 2 energy setup attack, and then if that Pokemon still had the Shockwave marker on it, which means your opponent hasn't teched the Tropius, which was seen in 0.01% of decks, and your opponent didn't evolve or devolve, because I believe I read an article last night from Pokegym that says devolving also removes the counters or the markers. Well, I have not said the sentence. I read an article on Pokegym last night in about 10 years, but
that's a good time right there.
But yeah, so you put the Electro Mark on. You could do this turn 2 because it's 2 energy, and you could candy the Tyranitar down. So put a Shockwave marker on something. Maybe your opponent gets punished for playing a big basic down too early. They can't actually attack with it yet. So you put a Shockwave marker on it. Then next turn, attach another energy and pop it. But what's so important is you can't pop and then pop again because you need another turn to set your Shockwave marker again. It's not like their linear designs you'll see today, like Amazing Rare Eviltal that just says, well, if somehow you jammed 5 energy onto this thing, just go nuts if you want to. This has checks and balance into the card. Even if your opponent doesn't have a direct counter for a Shockwave marker, they're still fine if they play well, because you put a Shockwave marker on something and then you knock it out, but then you're back to square one with no markers on the board again. So tell me what you think about this, and if you have any, like, maybe thoughts on what they could do with a marker like this today. Like, I was thinking even things like jamming net and headringer, which could be just another topic, could just be made into markers.
So I think there's so much different design space, and something that I kind of, because I've thought about design and like if I made cards a lot, and the marker concept I think is something that you can literally create a marker to do so many different types of game effects and have it never feel old, because you can literally make a game rule like they did with a GX counter. So like it's not that like adding something to the game is like unheard of at this point. But with Tyranitar specifically, I'm going to get into first. Tyranitar itself didn't end up like panning out to be a super competitive card, but it's interesting on a design scale. And that's because there are things such as like, I mean, back in the day, you would have like a 150 HP Pokemon, you put some metal energies on it, and that thing's not dying anytime soon outside of certain cards that can just one-shot things for extreme costs. But with Tyranitar, he looks at it, puts a counter on it, and then he snaps it out of existence. And I think that in and of itself is cool because it makes sure that the game is at least going to take X amount of time and give your opponent X amount of chances to race you. And it's not in the same way as like ADP, where like, well, your opponent has X amount of time, which just happens to be maybe 3 turns. Good luck, buddy. Also, get Marnied each turn out of your hand. Like it just like I think that putting it on a stage 2 EX, putting it at energy costs that required you to continuously attach your energy and not be able to whiff, because we didn't have things like DCE. EX have energy acceleration outside of, like, they didn't have like specific energy acceleration. You couldn't welder onto this thing. You couldn't like just power this thing up without manually attaching in most situations.
Candying a Flygon, and then you have to have 2 stage 2s to power it up. So things like that.
They did make Altaria EX Delta specifically to like power up these things, but that comes at its own cost. It's an EX with only 100 HP with a Poke Power that gets hit by different effects that deal damage counters to Poke Powers or EXs. And it's just, again, that layering. So I think Tyranitar is interesting design space because it explores what more ways of what a counter can do. So where it's cool in a lot of the ways that Gardevoir was, in that it gives you decisions and it it punishes your opponent based on playing, and that's just another way of layering the game. As far as counters that like the game could see today, I think it would be really, really cool if like, what if there was like a Celebi or Dialga that it dealt 50 damage and then put a time counter on your opponent's Pokemon, and at the end of the turn that a Pokemon has a time counter on it, it devolves. Like that would be such cool design space, because they're sitting there and they know that it's going to happen now, and so they've got to then plan around the fact that at the end of the turn, this Eternatus de-evolves and goes back to the hand, and then only has the 220 underneath it. Like it would be. I think that's something that they could explore. I think that putting a counter on a Pokemon to where you maybe putting counters on your own Pokemon, like this Pokemon can't be impacted by trainer cards. Like at the,
that
like
would
you
be
could
good.
that you could sit there and be like, all right, this guy isn't getting bosses ordered. Like you could put a counter to where, I mean, and I don't like, this may be overpowered, but you could put it on something where the cost like is equal to the payoff. But you could make it to where you could put a counter on a Pokemon that says when your opponent knocks it out, they take one less prize. Like and just like there's so much different design space, and you could just make like you could call it their own counter even, but just like have like some kind of marker thing that you're like that they put on cards, or you could use quarters or whatever. But it's just like that's another layer of design space that like it's not unheard of for a Pokemon to have a counter on it, like poison or burn at this point, or anything like that. GX markers were added to the game. It's just like that more design space that can create more decisions, and things like that. I mean, those are literally just basically off the top of my head even. And there's so much room to where I think if they explore that in the future, it'd be a really cool concept to bring back.
Yeah, what it made me think of was when you said like, if this Pokemon, because like nowadays if we had that ability, it would be like Dialga uses turn back time 60 damage if at the end of your opponent's next turn the defending Pokemon devolves, but they could just play switch and that effect's gone. I was ranting about Sableye from Vivid Voltage in a recent video, because for 2 energy it does 20, and then the defending Pokemon can't use a specific attack next turn. And that would be a really good Brave Blade counter if they couldn't just switch Air Balloon and then use Brave Blade. If like you put a counter on it that lasted 1 turn no matter where that Pokemon went, something like that. But I'm sure we could go back and forth all day with marker ideas. But yeah, if anybody watching has ideas for markers or liked any of ours and you want to kind of go off of them, just leave it in the comments below, because I'd love to read ideas for different kind of markers and things like that. Because the imprison markers and shockwave markers like are something that were so unique but didn't have to be so unique. Like that could have, like, one person at Creatures just like saying why don't we try this again could have made markers just be like a common thing we know about today. But and like you said, GX counters came in, GX the flippy things, whatever, the GX attacks, and having like a GX marker on the board, like that became just a norm. Like they said, we're having GX attacks now, and that wasn't a big thing. It didn't stop new players from getting into the game just because there was a GX attack and a regular attack, you know. So like they do introduce new things all the time. Just recently the new things they introduce have been very, very plain.
And I think that it's just like interesting because there's just so much design space. Like you said, we could go back and forth all day with ideas of what markers could be. And I think if they could explore the design space of both putting it on the opponent's Pokemon or putting it on your own for beneficial effects, and just like there's so many different ways that you can layer the game and make it more interesting while also not like making it too confusing. Like if I place this marker on your Pokemon and I have a Pokemon in play that says what the marker is going to do, that's not confusing. Like,
we're not making the Always Sunny meme with Pepe Sylvia. Like it's like, especially even if it was like every block they introduced 2 markers, like Imprison and Shockwave. Like you buy one starter deck and you know what both of the what both of the marks do. Or you
Yeah.
visit Pokemon.com once and they say, oh, well, this mark says they can't use ability. This mark says that a Pokemon can use an attack that says it's knocked out. Like, that's super simple. Like, you might have to go back and read it one more time. Like, that's super simple to remember. It's just another very small rule that sometimes won't even become part of your game.
Mm-hmm.
And especially in the time of online right now, the PTCGO would tell you what it did. So like, but that's also not whole other rant. That's not that's not even a thought for creatures because Japan doesn't have an online game. Let's move on.
Sounds good.
So my last card also, I think James and I kind of compromised on this one, and James alluded to this one multiple times. The last one is PAL Hand Extension, and this is a card that like I've found copies of in my old stuff over the summer. Like this is a card that I pulled multiple times, got in starter decks back when I was a kid in 2004, but I never played a competitive format with PAL Hand Extension. Last night I was playing EX All on TCG1, and I was just like, wow, PAL Hand Extension is so well designed. It's like a counter catcher and an Anaporter in one for modern terms. So I'll just read it real quickly. You may use this only if you have more prize cards left in your opponent. Move one energy card attached to defending Pokemon to another of your opponent's Pokemon, or switch one of your opponent's benched Pokemon with one of the defending Pokemon. That part's just because there used to be 2v2 rules, so that last part of text wouldn't really matter today. One might say this is even a little bit overpowered. I wouldn't really mind if this was even split into two cards today, so if we had Counter Catcher and if we had like Counter Energy Denial or Counter Energy Removal, or like Counter Hammer, and you don't have to flip a coin and you remove an energy. But yeah, PAL Hand Extension, it gives you two options, which are great, which we've been talking about this whole video, James and I, saying, you know, more decisions are good, more options are good. It gives you a chance to either play well or play poorly. It's something the opponent will know about if it's a popular card in the meta. And it's also can only be used when you are losing the game, which means this isn't going to work for you on turn one and snowball your lead. It's going to help you come back. And now, James, I know you said this is one of your favorite card designs ever, if not your absolute favorite. So do you have any fond memories? Like, how did you feel about this in competitive back then, and kind of how do you feel about it in EX All now?
So I felt that it was super, super, super well designed back then, back 2006, Worlds 2006. Worlds 2005 is like Nats 2000 or Worlds 2005 is when it really, really took off over in the United States. But Worlds 2006, it was super important in the winning deck. I think that PAL Hand Extension in particular is very cool because again it punishes aggression, blind aggression I should say, because you do have the way to play around it. You do have the way to not bench extraneous things. You do have to get powed up. It's basically how we talk about it nowadays when we discuss it. But it just creates such interesting design space because given the context of the format, PAL Hand Extension was not legal in a format that had Trainer Gust as any kind of option outside of PAL Hand Extension, which can only be used from behind. So you're not just sitting there taking KOs, pointing down whatever you want to deal with next. Like, you actively have to be behind in order to even use it.
Yeah.
Creating the decision to remove energy from your opponent's Pokemon was also really, really interesting for a lot of reasons. One was a lot of the energy acceleration that wasn't like Pokepower based was specifically for evolved non-EX or GX Pokemon. And or V or whatever the mechanic is that you want to discuss. But at the time it was EX.
Yeah.
And that was really interesting because if you use that to like attach energy early, essentially get ahead on prizes and take a knockout, and you had a basic on your bench that card can't be attached to, I can pow that energy off of your Pokemon, send it to a Pokemon that it can't be attached to, and then it just gets discarded. So
Right.
it ended up being like a way to backdoor energy removal
Yep.
and gust of wind, but only for a player that is currently losing the game. And when you combine this with Rocket's admin, it creates this very interesting play from behind format that forces both players to pick and choose when they KO their opponent's Pokemon very specifically. And that, I think, is the defining factor of Worlds 2006 in particular, and the EX all format, or Ruby Sapphire through Power Keepers format. Because if you just go into those formats with a deck that's like, I'm going to punch people until my prizes are gone, you are going to lose almost every game because these cards are so widespread. Rocket's admin is in every deck. POW hand extension was in most decks because most decks were trying to play from behind, because the power level of that card and the decisions that it gave you over the game, because like I was saying, you didn't have a way to gust Pokemon up outside of like specific Pokemon themselves. You didn't have a way to like choose what your opponent's active became. Now, I just, my opinion on the card was a 10 out of 10 back then and has gone higher now because it creates such decisions, and that both players have to be aware of exactly what's happening, or going ahead is just going to cost you in every single situation. Now, the problem that you get into with how powerful this card is going to ring true with a lot of people that play Standard, in that the Oranguru control decks of the current day, or, well, not anymore, rest in peace, Monkey, but like, the way that they would lock you is they'd bring up a guy and they would get rid of your energy cards. Now, back then, we had access to a Minun from EX Deoxys that said you can put any one card from your discard pile into your hand for a single energy. So it's very similar to Oranguru in that it recycles your resources. Now, the issue with this is that you can end up powing up one of your opponent's bench Pokemon, powing off all of the energy from it as they attach them one at a time, and basically lock your opponent's active up front, and then either deal with their bench or mill them out. Because you're also adding cards to your hand every time that you use Sniff Out with Minun, and they're going to eventually run out of cards, and you have infinite Rockets admin so that you never run out of cards. And that's kind of where this card, if you just added it to like today's format, I don't know. This is the kind of card that you have to design around to make sure that it isn't going to be too powerful.
Yeah.
In a format where you're not able to recycle those types of resources, I think that this could be very powerful. But like giving this to like a format, even with like the Excadrill of today that shuffles the cards back into your deck, I think that it would be too powerful for that type of strategy specifically. If we were just in a format like the Zoroark years that didn't have a Oranguru, I think that it would be interesting because people would be hitting each other back and forth and have to pick and choose where they take their KOs, or else they end up risking getting something on the bench brought up, powing the DCEs off of it, or moving them around to where it doesn't have access to them anymore, and then dealing with them in whatever way you choose. But it's just another card that is so well designed because it also can influence your deck building.
Yeah.
Like Pokemon that would knock themselves out, so that forcing your opponent to take prizes, like Electrode EX back in the day, which Electrode GX was the spiritual successor of, in that you would pop it, give your opponent 2 prizes, take 5 energy out of your discard, put them on your board, then you unleash a flurry of POW hand extensions to set up the board however you want to be favorable, play a Rockets admin, shuffle them down to 4, and then have your way with the board.
Yeah.
And honestly, I made that sound more degenerate than it actually is, because at the end of the day, you are giving your opponent 2 prizes in the process. So if
Mhm.
they either have a board already set up or are able to come back from that, then you're going to be in a lot of trouble because you are playing from behind still.
I think
But
what's important is that today we're thinking, okay, I'm going to disrupt my opponent, get rid of their energy, get rid of their hand, set up my 5 energy, and then I'm going to knock out a 3 prizer. Back then,
mhm,
you might have very well been doing 80 damage or knocking out something that's worth 1 prize. And then
yep.
next turn, maybe you knock out something that's worth 1 prize. And then next turn, maybe you knock something else worth 1 prize. And by then, your opponent's back and you have a board where you're up by 1 prize at the end of it all.
Yep.
Right? Like
And that's
today.
kind of the thing. It's the speed of the games. Like all of these disruption type effects are so much weaker in a world where you don't where you have so many more turns to draw out of them.
Right.
Like Lass in base set, and this is taking another tangent, but it's just a similar type thing where it falls in line with there. It disrupts your opponent super heavily, but because you're only doing 10 to 20 damage a turn, your opponent has a lot more time to draw back out of that effect. And that's why Crushing Hammer of today has gotten so much more use in the last 4 months than it has the entirety of its legality,
Yep.
because the games are so short that disrupting your opponent to any degree early to make them whiff a single attack is going to win you the game regardless of the matchup in a lot of scenarios.
Yeah, so like Pika Rom is so weak compared to the new Eternatus VMAX. I mean, it sucks that like a card from a year ago is like so outmatched by a card from the next year. Like we've never seen a power creep like this, in my opinion. Such an accelerated power creep. But like you said, like Pika Rom can just say, okay, let's see if I hit a Hammerheads, then I get a free turn of dealing 200 and 170 next turn. And I've talked about that on the channel. Like if your games are lasting 5 turns instead of 10, Crushing Hammer becomes 100% more influential. Like if you're getting rid of 1 turn from your opponent out of 5 turns of the game instead of getting rid of 1 turn out of 10 turns of the game, that's so much different. Like they only have like 1 turn max to regroup if it's a 5 turn game, but in a 10 turn game they have like a while to regroup before it's going to matter if they don't regroup. Like even as recent as last year in Hartford, I remember this kind of encompasses most of what we've talked about today. A Zorogar mirror between myself and Danny Altavia. I went up a 1-6 prize lead, so I only needed to take 1 more prize to win. And he got Toxin, and then every turn he would take 1 prize with Riotous Beating, and I was on a 6 turn timer to come back from the game. I ended up never getting the 1 or 2 card combination to come back into that game, so he just swept through, knocking out like 4 single prizes in a Zorak GX or something like that. But it was a situation where I had like 3 to 4 turns where if I can get something going here, I can make a comeback. Where in today, you have like that next turn, and if you miss it, it's done. So even as recent as like a year ago and expanded, you could come back from these kinds of things. And I'm not really sure where that started, but just the pace of the game, like it's accelerated the power creep so much in so little time.
Honestly, I think that it did start with the introduction of the 3 prize mechanic, and I think that there's still, like, I'm not saying that 3 prize mechanic is bad. It's not been around long enough, even with the tag teams, in my opinion, to actually like for me to create a specific opinion on what I think that mechanic is. But I do think that it specifically has sped up the game, because I think it wouldn't have if it was just the VMAXs, but the tag teams themselves were so pushed with the amount of damage that they did.
And being basic Pokemon.
So the VMAXs not only have to evolve, and while they are dealing ridiculous damage, most of them, if not all of them question mark
They can't
have to two-shot each other.
Yeah, they can't reasonably one-shot each other. So things like Lapras VMAX can, but it takes a lot. Something like Centiskorch VMAX can, but they have to reach. Pokemon dealing their capped damage, if they do have a capped damage, cannot one-shot each other without weakness.
Yeah, and I think that's why, like, I keep telling people just hold on.
Sword and Shield on.
I've been in this game so long. I've seen from Hitmonchan to now, and like, it gets bad sometimes, objectively or perspectively, but regardless, I see the makings of a good potential decision-based two-shot or more format in the future, even with the 3-prize mechanic coming. We've just got to hold on another 8 months or whatever, because
until
I
tag
do
teams
believe
are gone.
that the wheels came off the train at the end of the Sun and Moon block.
Yep.
And it's not even just ADP or anything, but
nope, it's not.
I have faith. I really do have faith that we are going to see a return to a better, more decision-based standard format.
I hope you're right, and I do agree with, like, I think everything you said. Like, I was against the ban ADP thing, but not because I like ADP. It was because I thought tag teams as a whole were the problem. It was more like, okay, sure, you can ban ADP, but Luke Metal is a very, very strong Pokemon that, without Zacian and Zamazenta, probably wouldn't be anything where it is right now. But I'm not saying Zacian and Zamazenta are toxic cards for the game. Sure, did they give Zacian a lot because it's the box legendary? Yeah, they gave it a lot. Yeah. But Luke Metal having this accelerated power due to it being a tag team, so they allow it to have more power, having that plus kind of GX attack that tag teams come with. I think Luke Metal would be very, very dominant if ADP wasn't around, and together ADP and Luke Metal are fairly dominant, and even Reshizard still sees play. Like, I realized how good Reshizard still is last week playing in the Hexter tournament, because my opponent playing Baby Blounds dropped a Reshizard and did attach Welder blow me up, and I can't respond because it has Outrage, and I was capping at 230 damage because I was playing Luke Metal Z. So there's actually nothing I can do because it has way too much HP and way too much damage, even though I was playing cards that came out a year after it. Like, the tag teams have been the problem for me all along, and like I said, specifically after Team Up. Like, Team Up was fine for me, but just a 3-prize Pokemon, when you I don't know, it being basic and having energy acceleration and the speed of today, it's like saying deal 10 damage to somebody in Magic on turn 2. Like, that's half of their life. Like, having 3 prizes down and it being knocked out on turn 2 is half of your life, half of your prize cards. So I do hope that when tag teams rotate, it gets better, but also tag teams kind of forced them to make VMAX as strong as they did, and the power creep it was power creep and then power creep, and I'm afraid of where we're going next.
Yeah, and I think that there can be a return to normalcy, quote unquote, in the future, even, where, like, I don't think there was a way to accurately depower the format and still have, like, imagine if VMAXs came out and they were objectively worse than tag teams, how much worse of a situation we would be in.
And they were at first. That's what happened with Sword and Shield base.
Didn't get better than the first VMAXs. Like,
yeah, it would still be ADP Pika Rom Reshizard.
Yeah, and like, it kind of still is, but like, there's at least some things to do.
Exactly.
And I do think that as we move forward, maybe there's a new 3-prize mechanic in the future. Maybe after Sword and Shield block, we don't have 3 prizes and we go back to 2 or 1, or only one or the other. Like, I think it would be interesting if everything cost 2. Like, I'm not saying do it. I'm just saying, like, maybe that's something they could explore. Like,
because we have gone from multiple back to single only. We have done that before. And so it is possible.
That reset specifically is probably going to happen.
Yeah, I think it would be the Diamond and Pearl to Black and White reset. Would that be it? Yeah.
Yep. And I mean, it's kind of lining up, honestly, because all of these rumors of the Diamond and Pearl game coming out next and everything like that. I mean, we start heading into a Diamond and Pearl block and we've got all single prize Pokemon again, I think that might be a little planned. But and that's obviously complete speculation and completely off of Powhandic's decision, but it all ties into what the game is now and how cards like these would apply. And I do think that specifically the 3 prize mechanic in and of itself may have not been the mistake, but tag teams specifically were a little bit too overpowered.
100%. And VMAXs, there's probably a world where VMAXs could have stayed at 2 prizes and just been a little weaker if tag teams never happened. If we just carried out with GX Pokemon all the way until Sword and Shield, maybe we could have had level X's on top of V's, and that was what VMAXs could have been potentially. And then they wouldn't have had to be as strong because we wouldn't need them to one-shot tag teams to keep tag teams away.
Because like the mechanic of like essentially what the VMAXs are Mega Pokemon without the Spirit Links, which is like a fine version of power creep in my opinion. Like you're evolving Pokemon, if they just were still 2 prizes like Mega Pokemon were but didn't need the Spirit Link, I think that in and of itself is a really interesting mechanic to explore. And I think it still is, and I think it still will be. But the thing is like Zacian had to be pushed in order to be playable alongside tag teams, because like we talked about with Charizard, they're always going to want certain Pokemon to be playable in the card game, and to see that like it's very hard to like sell your card game when it's like, oh yeah, it's a Azumarill versus Scyther. Like I think that's really cool.
Yeah, Scyther's a cool Pokemon. What are you saying?
I agree, but like I don't know if that would appeal as much. And you see it in the video game, right? They just released all the legendaries and brought them back to the VGC format.
Oh yeah,
like they actively want the casually cool Pokemon to be at the top, and while other things should be able to compete, I think that we're always going to see a world now, at least, where you are going to have cards push, you are going to have legendary Pokemon or popular starter Pokemon pushed to try and make them playable in the card game, and it all just like snowballs off of that.
Yeah, and I think like that's fine. Like the problem is like where you said like when they start pushing the card after its release. So like, yeah, okay, so let's design this blank piece of paper. We're giving it this HP, this attack, this ability. Okay, and then we're going to pick the box legendary. We're slapping it on. Great. We made this awesome design and we get to push the Pokemon. But then 4.5 sets later, they're like, let's give it Rusty Sword. And Rusty Sword, like, even if ADP wasn't around, I'd still be like, why are you giving Rusty Sword to Zacian? But I don't think it would seem toxic. Like, to people in America, people are like, why would they do this to us? But then over in Japan, ADPZ is like barely even performing right now because these cards are being designed for a different game than we're playing.
Yep, because I mean they're still mostly playing Ultra Prism on, aren't they?
Yeah, like, it's Ultra Prism through Vivid Voltage and then whatever else they have right now. And like their top, like ADPZ didn't even crack top 8 at the Yokohama, and Yokohama was 1650 Masters. And there was 1 ADP in top 16 and 1 ADP in top 32, I think. And then like the rest was like Luke Metal Zacian, Colossal VMAX, Baby Blounds. Like, you know, still older decks, but like ADPZ isn't overly played there, and that could be maybe they don't like it, but I don't know. But these cards are being designed for a different game, kind of, and that's like a whole nother conversation.
Yeah, and I knew we were going to talk about Rusty Sword, or at least touch on it, and I just think that like I think that honestly, I think that again, Rusty Sword feels like a card being designed for a Sword and Shield on format. Because I mean, Zacian's always going to be playable as long as it's legal, in my opinion. It's kind of going to be the evil Tall EX of this generation.
Yeah, I think it's kind of like Zoroark GX, except Zoroark GX didn't one-shot things, so I never minded it.
Yeah, and I think that Zacian, honestly, once it loses ADP, it may need a little bit of a boost.
Yeah.
And I know that sounds really odd, and I could be wrong, and that's fine. Yell at me on Twitter at Wames Games when that happens. But I think that in the Sword and Shield on format, if everybody is playing a bunch of 330 HP VMAXs and we don't have access to the tag teams anymore, maybe Zacian isn't where it's at anymore.
Yeah, because Rusty Sword won't actually change math for you anymore. It's you're already one-shotting other Vs, but you're never one-shotting a VMAX with Zacian.
Yep.
So like Rusty Sword right now is actually going to be very, very relevant. But if it's Sword and Shield on, which I was saying like, oh please just rotate the Sword and Shield on right away, get rid of the tag teams, but like Rusty Sword doesn't actually matter, like you're saying. Like you're gonna two-shot VMAXs with or without it, and you're gonna one-shot Vs without it. So
yeah, and I just think that like if the worst thing that happens to me this year or this next year is that ADP beats me a little bit harder until it rotates than it already was going to.
Yeah. Like,
please let that be the story of my 2021 after the year we've had.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's probably a good place to end. So I hope you all enjoyed this. If you made it to the end of the video, congratulations. There is no prize except you got to finally hear a tidbit about Rusty Sword there. So I hope you all enjoyed the video. James, do you have any shout outs for the lovely people?
Sure. I stream all kinds of stuff on the Twitches, and I am kind of still learning my way around that and getting better at that. But if you guys want to check it out, I do play Pokemon trading card game. I play a bunch of the Pokemon video games, and I do a bunch of other stuff too. It's twitch.tv/WamesGamesTV. I am going to be streaming the Players Cup this weekend on Saturday, I guess is when that event is.
Yep.
And I don't know what I'm playing, but it won't be ADP, so it'll be fun to watch me for approximately 2 rounds. And if you want to follow me on Twitter at Wames Games, I rant a lot. So if you like listening or arguing with a lot of what I just said for the last 2 hours, please feel free to yell at me on there. And beyond that, I mean, I just thank you for having me on, and I hope everybody had a good time, and I hope to be able to join you in the future and discuss some more cards.
Absolutely. So if you would like a pal hand extension of James Rants, be sure to go follow him on Twitter and Twitch. And subscribe to this channel if you have not already for daily Pokemon TCG content. Leave a thumbs up and comment and all kinds of engagement if you like this video and you want more like this to continue to happen. Check out my sponsor, PotownStore.com, the best place to get PTCGO codes. Use code Celio for 5% off. They have Vivid Voltage in stock. They will always have Vivid Voltage in stock. Releases happening in like a week. I don't know when you're seeing this video because I don't know my upload schedule. Professional Pokemon YouTuber. Have a great day, and I'll see you next time here on Celio's Network.